The year is 1784. In the rolling, forested hills of Virginia, a man stands before a massive mound of earth. This is not a natural hill. It is a prehistoric Native American burial mound, silent and mysterious, holding the secrets of a forgotten past. The man holding the spade is Thomas Jefferson. He is not yet the President of the United States, but he is already a figure of immense influence. And on this day, he is about to do something that will shock the intellectual world of the late 18th century. He is about to slice a trench directly through this monument of earth, systematically dissecting the layers of human bones buried within. How did Thomas Jefferson debunk a popular myth about Native American mounds? To answer this, we must step back into a time when the history of the American continent was shrouded in prejudice, political convenience, and outright fabrication. Today, we look back at the Founding Fathers as men of ink and paper, debating in polished rooms. But in the summer of 1784, Jefferson was knee-deep in the clay of Virginia, surrounded by the dry, crumbling remains of a civilization that many claimed never existed. He was not looking for gold, he was looking for facts. The history books often paint this era as a time of simple pioneering. But beneath the surface of the early American landscape lay a fierce intellectual battleground. Jefferson was about to throw himself into the middle of it, armed with a shovel, a methodical mind, and a stubborn refusal to accept the common wisdom of his day. What he found in that trench did not just change how we look at the soil beneath our feet. It shattered a lie that had been manufactured to justify the conquest of an entire continent. To understand why Jefferson took this risk, you have to understand the lie. In the late 18th century, as European settlers pushed past the Appalachian Mountains, they ran into something they did not expect. Scattered across the valleys, rivers, and forests of North America were thousands of massive, sophisticated earthen structures. These were not simple heaps of dirt. They were monumental earthworks. Some were shaped like giant serpents winding through the grass. Others were massive flat-topped pyramids, engineered with precise geometry, rising dozens of feet into the air. These structures, which we now call mounds, were everywhere. In Virginia alone, archaeological studies have since identified 13 of these prehistoric mounds, scattered across the Piedmont, Ridge, and Valley areas. To the settlers who wanted to farm this land, these mounds were a problem. They were physical proof of a deep, organized, and settled history. They suggested that the people who lived there had been there for a very long time, building complex societies. But the settlers had a job to do. They had to clear the land and claim it. To do that comfortably, they needed to believe that the people they were displacing had no right to it. So a convenient myth was born. The settlers looked at the mounds, looked at the Native Americans, and declared that the two had nothing to do with each other. The common belief of the time was simple. Native Americans were too primitive, too disorganized, and too lazy to have built such monumental works. Instead, the myth claimed that a vanished, civilized race had built the mounds. This lost civilization, the story went, had been wiped out by the ancestors of the current native populations. Think about how convenient this narrative was for the colonizers. If the Native Americans had destroyed a great, civilized race to take the land, then the settlers were not stealing land from its rightful owners. They were simply reclaiming the continent for civilization. They were avenging the lost builders. This was not just a harmless campfire story. It was a politically motivated myth, designed to ease the conscience of an expanding nation. It was accepted by the public, debated by intellectuals, and printed in early histories. Everyone seemed to agree on it, except for Jefferson. He lived in a region where these mounds existed. He walked past them, he looked at the landscape of Virginia, and he realized that the stories people were telling did not match the physical reality of the earth. He decided that, instead of repeating the rumors, He would test the myth using the only thing that could not lie, the physical evidence buried in the ground. But testing this myth was not as simple as picking up a spade. In the 1780s, the field of archaeology did not exist. The study of the past was dominated by a hobby known as antiquarianism. During the late 18th century, the study of the past was characterized by haphazard artifact collecting and treasure hunting. If you were a wealthy gentleman of leisure, you did not study the past to understand human behavior. You did it to show off. Antiquarians were essentially glorified treasure hunters. They wanted beautiful things to put on the shelves of their private libraries. They wanted coins, intact pottery, weapons, and strange relics. To get these things, they did not use care. They used brute force. Wealthy collectors would hire laborers to dig random, chaotic holes into ancient ruins, stone circles, and burial mounds. They did not care about the context of the objects. They did not care about the soil they were destroying. If a spade smashed through a skeleton to reach a relic, the skeleton was thrown aside. No records were kept. No measurements were taken. No one wrote down which object came from which layer of dirt. Once an antiquarian took an artifact home, the site was left ruined, its historical context permanently erased. It was a destructive, greedy process that treated the earth like a giant lottery ticket. Jefferson looked at this chaotic approach and saw it for what it was, a tragedy. He understood that when you dig up a site without recording the details, you are not saving history. You are destroying the only copy of a book before anyone has a chance to read it. He realized that the objects themselves were only part of the story. The real information lay in how those objects were positioned, what was buried next to them, and how deep they lay in the earth. He wanted to do something different. He wanted to turn this destructive hobby into a systematic inquiry. He rejected haphazard digging, choosing instead to apply methodical excavation techniques. But to do that, he would have to invent the rules of the game as he went along. In 1784, Jefferson began his excavation of a prehistoric Native American burial mound in Virginia. This was a region where archaeological studies have since identified 13 mounds in the Piedmont, Ridge, and Valley areas. Jefferson decided to target a specific mound for an investigation. This was a radical move. In the late 18th century, digging up graves was seen as dirty, low-class work, suitable for laborers or grave robbers, not for a respected statesman. If he failed, if he found nothing, or if he was caught desecrating a grave for no scientific gain, his reputation would be severely damaged. But Jefferson was willing to risk his standing. He did not want to dig for gold. He wanted to answer specific, testable questions. Who built this mound? How was it constructed? And most importantly, did the bones inside show signs of a massive, violent clash of civilizations? Or did they tell a quieter story of a people living and dying over generations? In the late summer of 1784, Jefferson gathered his tools and his workers. He stood before the mound. If he had followed the standard antiquarian practice of his day, he would have started at the very top. He would have dug a messy hole straight down into the center, looking for the most valuable items, and piled the discarded dirt around the edges. Instead, Jefferson did something that had never been done before in the history of excavation. He looked at the mound not as a chest to be opened, but as a book to be read page by page. He rejected haphazard digging. He instructed his workers to cut a clean, vertical trench directly through the center of the mound, slicing it in half from one side to the other. Imagine the scene: the hot Virginia sun beating down on the clay, the sound of metal spades slicing through roots and compacted earth. As the trench grew deeper, the walls of the cut became smooth and vertical. Jefferson did not let his workers just throw the dirt away. He stood in the trench, watching the exposed cross-section of the earth. What he saw was a revelation. The walls of the trench were not a uniform brown. They were striped. There were distinct, horizontal layers of different colors and textures of soil, separated by bands of human skeletal remains. By making this vertical cut, Jefferson was considering stratigraphy, the geological layering of the soil, to analyze the mound. Stratigraphy was a concept that geologists were only beginning to understand for rocks. No one had ever thought to apply it to human history. Jefferson realized that the Earth was a timeline. The deeper you went, the further back in time you traveled. The top layer was the most recent. The bottom layer was the oldest. This simple insight changed everything. As the trench widened, Jefferson began his work in earnest. He did not just grab bones and throw them into baskets. He stood in the damp slot in the earth and began to collect data. He gathered both qualitative and quantitative data. He counted the skulls. He measured the thickness of the bone layers. He noted the state of preservation of the remains. He observed that the bones at the very bottom of the mound in the deepest strata were soft, crumbling, and nearly reclaimed by the damp clay. They were ancient, but as his eyes moved up the vertical wall of the trench, the bones in the middle layers became firmer, and the ones near the surface were relatively fresh and intact. This was the crucial clue. If the mound had been built all at once, say to bury the dead after a single massive event, the bones would all be in the same state of decay. They would have been exposed to the elements and the soil for the exact same amount of time. But they were not. The varying levels of decay proved beyond a doubt that the mound was not a single, sudden construction. It had accumulated over a vast span of time. Generations of people had come to this exact spot, deposited their dead, covered them with a layer of earth, and walked away, only for their descendants to return years later and do the same. Jefferson was reading the Strata of Death, and the story it told was one of deep, slow time. It was a story of continuity, not catastrophe. But he needed to address the core of the myth, the great battle. Those who argued for the lost race theory insisted that these mounds were battle pits. They claimed that the civilized builders had made a desperate last stand against the invading Native American hordes. The mounds, they said, were filled with the bodies of young men who had fallen in combat. Jefferson decided to test this claim. He did not just look at the layers, he looked at the bones themselves. He examined the remains with the eye of a physical anthropologist. He looked for signs of trauma. If this was a battlefield, there would be broken bones, crushed skulls, and skeletal remains with weapons embedded in the ribs. There would be marks of axes and knives. He found nothing of the sort. Instead, as he carefully cleared the dirt from the skulls and limbs, he noticed something else. These were not the bodies of young soldiers. The bones belonged to individuals of all ages. He found the tiny, fragile skulls of infants. He found the bones of young children, women, and the worn joints of the elderly. He also noticed the lack of weapon trauma. There were no arrowheads lodged in the vertebrae. There were no shattered skulls that suggested a violent end. This was the classic reversal. The very evidence that was supposed to prove a violent, single-day massacre of a lost race proved the exact opposite. This was not a war grave. It was a cemetery. The presence of infants, children, and old people showed that this was a community burying its own over decades, perhaps centuries. The single battlefield theory was dead, buried under the weight of Jefferson's empirical data. If it was not a battlefield, then what was it? How did these bones get here in this strange, layered fashion? Jefferson looked closely at the arrangement of the skeletons. They were not laid out side by side in neat, orderly rows. They were not buried in coffins, nor were they stretched out in individual graves. Instead, the bones were found in scattered, collective bundles. In some places, skulls were piled together. In others, leg bones and arm bones were bound in heaps, lying in wild, disjointed angles. It looked as if the bodies had been allowed to decompose elsewhere. And then, at a later date, the bones had been gathered up, cleaned, bundled together, and brought to this mound for collective burial. Jefferson realized this matched historical accounts of Native American rituals. Several regional tribes were known to practice collective secondary burial. Every few years, they would retrieve the remains of their deceased relatives from temporary graves, carry them to a central location, and bury them together in a communal ossuary. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The physical structure of the mound, the layering of the soil, the state of the bones, and the bundle burials all aligned perfectly with the known customs of the Native Americans. There was no need to invent a lost race. There was no need to construct elaborate stories of ancient European voyagers or vanished civilizations. The people who built the mounds were the ancestors of the very people the settlers were currently driving off their land. The evidence pointed to a long-term, stable, and deeply rooted culture that had returned to the same sacred spot along the Virginia landscape for generations. Today, this conclusion seems obvious to us, but in the 1780s, publishing these findings was a dangerous intellectual move. Jefferson published his scientific conclusions regarding Native American history, despite the prevailing historical climate of his era, doing so at the direct risk of his own reputation. The prevailing historical climate of the late 18th century was deeply hostile to any theories that elevated the history or capabilities of Native Americans. The dominant view among European and American intellectuals was that the New World was inherently inferior, and its indigenous peoples lacked the intelligence and capacity to build complex societies. By proving that Native Americans had built complex, enduring monumental structures over centuries, Jefferson was challenging these deeply entrenched prejudices. To defend the capabilities of the continent's indigenous peoples was to invite ridicule from intellectuals and anger from those who sought to justify the displacement of native populations. Jefferson was risking his reputation as a rational statesman by standing up for the scientific truth. Yet he did not hesitate. He put his findings in writing, presenting his empirical data to the public, and challenging his readers to abandon speculation in favor of physical evidence. He did not offer wild theories. He let the dirt speak for itself. His published conclusions became a landmark event. They were read by scientists and intellectuals across the Atlantic. While praised by some for their rigor, they also drew sharp criticism from those who were heavily invested in the myth of the lost race. The land speculators and the racial theorists did not want to hear that the mounds were built by Native Americans. They wanted to keep believing the lie because the lie served their interests. But Jefferson had put the data on the record. Once the data was published, it could not be ignored. Yet despite the brilliance of Jefferson's work, the world was not ready for it. His insistence on stratigraphy, systematic recording, and problem-oriented excavation was a century ahead of its time. After Jefferson finished his dig, the field of archaeology did not immediately adopt his methods. For the next 100 years, the study of the past in America largely reverted to destructive treasure hunting and haphazard digging. As the nation expanded, collectors tore through ancient sites looking for relics, throwing the bones of the builders aside and continuing to write books about the lost mound builders. The empirical lessons of Jefferson's 1784 dig were largely ignored by the mainstream for a century. It was not until the late 19th century that systematic, stratigraphic methods of digging were widely adopted by professional archaeologists. They had to reinvent the methodology that Jefferson had already applied 100 years earlier. His work laid the foundation for the scientific methodology that defines modern archaeological inquiry today. His pioneering methods, which were a century ahead of their time, resulted in introductory textbooks and historians hailing him as the father of American archaeology and the first American archaeologist. Today, the significance of what he did in that Virginia dirt is recognized globally. Guinness World Records officially recognizes Jefferson's 1784 project as the world's first scientific archaeological excavation. He did not just dig a hole, he established a new way of looking at the past. He showed that the Earth is an archive, and that if we treat it with respect and scientific rigor, it will tell us the truth, no matter how much that truth conflicts with our prejudices. Because of his pioneering methods and scientific rigor, modern textbooks and historians hail Jefferson as the father of American archaeology. He is widely remembered by institutions as the first American archaeologist. He transformed a destructive hobby of grave robbing into a rigorous, systematic science. But this legacy remains deeply complex. There is a profound tension here. The man who proved the deep history and humanity of Native Americans through their burial mounds was also a man of his time, navigating the political ambitions of a young nation. The scientist who defended their past was operating within a political framework that would ultimately compromise their future. This complexity does not erase his scientific achievement, but it forces us to look at it clearly. Jefferson was a man of contradictions, capable of brilliant, objective insight, yet bound by the political realities of his era. And this brings us to the lesson of the Strata. Jefferson's excavation teaches us that comforting myths will always arise to justify the prejudices of the present. When we want to believe something because it serves our interests, we will invent stories, ignore evidence, and silence those who point to the truth. The only antidote to these self-serving narratives is the disciplined, objective pursuit of empirical truth. We must be willing to look beneath the surface of our assumptions, even when the evidence challenges our own convenience. Today, we are surrounded by modern myths, comfortable narratives designed to make us feel good about our choices. It is easy to accept them, but like the soil of Virginia, the truth is waiting to be uncovered. We must have the courage to pick up the shovel, to cut through the layers of prejudice, and to let the facts speak, no matter how deeply buried they may be. If you want to help us dig deeper into the forgotten corners of history, hit the subscribe button. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Jefferson's double legacy, and join us for the next investigation. The truth is out there, under the dirt.